All right. Well, thanks for being here. I guess we'll probably have some people trickling in. I'm here to tell you a bit about the Virgin Earth Challenge and what's going on there. And I like to work visually. A telephone pole, that's roughly a ton of CO2. So half of a tree is carbon. When it burns and decomposes, this tree emits about a ton of CO2. When you scale that up, this is quite a phenomenal picture. This is from a lumber salvage operation in Sweden after a big hurricane. So all these trees blew down and the government decided, well, we need to collect these trees and figure out something to do. But first they decided to stack them up. So what you're looking at is about a kilometer long pile of wood. What this picture represents is about 1 million tons of CO2. So putting that into the context of human CO2 emissions, every year humans emit 8 gigatons of carbon. That's about 32 billion tons of CO2, which is this picture times 32,000. So that's how much CO2 we emit every year through the combustion of fossil fuels. So what do? Now, it's very clear that increase in energy efficiency is pretty critical. There's no way around doing that, but we need more than that. Energy efficiency is not going to actually grab out the carbon that's in the atmosphere and address the legacy carbon emissions that we've already put up there. So in 2007, Al Gore was really championing this conversation. So he got to talking to Richard Branson, and he was pretty bothered about this, and has a couple sleepless nights on his island. What are you going to do? And he decided, let's put up a prize, $25 million science prize, the first team that can show that they have a pathway to a gigaton scale carbon negative solution. So basically, we're talking a gigaton scale. So putting this back into the picture that we saw, that is a significant amount of carbon. That's this pile of wood. It's 3,200. So 3,200 piles of this. So there were over 10,000 applicants, and they whittled that down to about 2,600 credible, about 100 in depth that they said, okay, well, you might be really onto something. Let's do some technical review. And then they visited people and really started to understand the science. And then they announced 11. The leading organizations, we've got air capture, we have biochar, we have BECCS, we've got enhanced weathering, and then we have land management. So these are kind of the portfolio of Virgin Earth Challenge shortlisted companies. So air capture is basically a big vacuum cleaner that sucks in air and strips out CO2 and solidifies it or keeps it in a liquid phase, and then uses that CO2 to do some work, maybe create liquid fuels, maybe inject into the ground for enhanced oil recovery, maybe to make plastics, maybe to make some other things. But basically it's a big filter for carbon in the air, and they're really focusing on that. So BECCS, basically what BECCS is a biomass-fired power plant that has carbon capture system on the back end of it to inject the CO2 back into the ground. So that's another novel idea. And then there's land management. So the Savory Institute basically is motivating cows to move through paddocks a little quicker and improve the grassland ecosystem and viability and really sequester carbon in the soil and improve fertility. So they've worked for about 40 years on this concept, and they're quite far along, and they're doing some really interesting work, and it's something to definitely consider as a viable option. And then you have biochar. There are 3 biochar companies that are on this short list, and we think that this is really great for the biochar industry because they think that there is a viable pathway potentially to a gigaton scale solution. So we should all be pretty excited about this. You've got different things going on, everything from a stove to a larger scale electric production.
This is a discussion about what we call the Initiative for a Carbon Negative Economy. We live in a petroleum economy today where we essentially are deriving energy from fossil fuels. Can we somehow turn this around, put carbon in the ground? Simple concept, but is it a pipe dream or is it something that can really be accomplished? I come from a geological, a soil, and earth science background. Key thing to realize is how big petroleum is. And this is in total mass. The point is that even with corn, total global maize production, we're producing and using annually 3 times the mass in oil. Oil is just a little over 1/3 of the current energy being consumed, and another half is coming from coal and natural gas. Renewables represents a relatively small fraction. This is the US monthly oil production, and look what's happened since 2008. We've increased almost 31%. Here's natural gas production. In 2006, it took a left turn and started going up. The oil industry has developed hydraulic fracking technology, tertiary recovery technology. It's going to be economically viable for a long time into the future. The size of these resources are enormous. The shale oils, these are extremely large resources in the U.S. Not only in the U.S., but globally. And it's going to spread from the U.S. to the rest of the world. I don't think it's going to peak in 20 years. I think it's going to continue growing unless there is a paradigm shift. So, there are, of course, a number of ways of creating a carbon negative system. Carbon capture and geological sequestration is one of them. They are a drag on the economy. You're not generating economic value. Biochar is potentially a unique exception to that, to generate economic value while producing energy, while sequestering carbon. And this is the thing that I find so attractive about biochar. We can certainly see some enhancement of soil quality, potentially enhancement of water quality. Where there is significant economic value is obviously looking at degraded lands or low-quality lands due to lack of water holding capacity or other issues. And it's not just increased yield that we can get on these low-quality lands. It's also increased value of the land itself. If you take land that is worth $500 an acre because it's non-productive, and you can turn it into a productive land, you can increase that value of the land to $5,000, $10,000 an acre. And suddenly that is real economic value. There are many other potential applications, horticulture, mine land reclamation, but we need to emphasize the economic value of those. One of the most exciting things that's coming out right now is the impact of char on soil water holding capacity. This is actual field data measured in the field. We used ICM char and put on 0 to 50 tons per acre or 0 to 112 megagrams per hectare char in these fields, and saw a linear increase in soil water holding capacity. And this takes me back to the sort of moral imperative. This is the GAP report. It's put out in 2010, and it was done by a consortia of large agricultural business as well as NGOs that actually got together and found common ground and said, what is it going to take to feed this planet? And their response was that we need to see a growth rate of about 1.75. What we're seeing is about 1.4. The key point here is that climate change is going to make even maintaining this 1.4 growth rate even harder, much harder. Bringing this to the conclusions, I know some people aren't going to want to hear this, but I believe we have to be working at an industrial scale. It was the industrial economic model that got us in this problem with climate change. It's going to take industry working to get us out of it. There's certainly room for small operators. There's certainly room for small cook stoves replacing the three-stone stoves. But we're not going to be able to solve climate change unless we work with industry and unless we work specifically with the energy sector.
We make liquid fuel. We make a drop-in liquid fuel. We make drop-in gasoline. We can make negative carbon gasoline. So how are we going to get this out, and what's the model to do that? We went to Google and they said, well, we don't like biofuels. And we think ethanol and corn and taking food. And we said, wait a second, you don't understand the process. We don't use food. We use renewable biomass. We use energy crops. We use agricultural waste. And they said, we'll take a look. And same thing. Everybody comes in very skeptical, and it takes a number of weeks to win them over. And when we finally do, they become big advocates. So if you'd like to see our founder, Mike Checky, did a very nice 12-minute presentation on YouTube. And if you look up Mike Checky and Solve for X, you'll see this.
The two things we're going to talk about today are climate change and world poverty. In the insert slide, we have the atmospheric CO2 for the last 1,000 years, and you can see it's been very stable. until recently, the beginning of Industrial Revolution. CO2 levels started to go up, and they're going up at an accelerating rate. Outcome is that we will see a rapid rise in sea level. And the worst fears of this are that as the global regions heat up and the ice caps melt, we uncover trapped CO2 and methane in the permafrost, and we start to heat up the deep ocean methane hydrate. And just in the last 6 months, we've seen reports of massive areas of the Arctic Ocean bubbling like champagne from methane coming up from the ocean floor. So we run the danger of the rapid change in temperature accelerating upon itself by exposing the polar regions, and that, of course, will accelerate the rise in sea level. And certainly one plausible scenario, we could displace 1 billion people, about 1/10 or more of the world population. And of course, what happens there is that starts to happen, and that sort of uses all of our resources as a civilization, so we can no longer address the core problem. In other words, if you have to relocate 1 billion people, you're not going to worry too much about whether your energy was carbon neutral or not. You're going to burn everything in sight to relocate them. So the IEA, the International Energy Agency, reported that they feel we have less than 5 years to address this problem. So it's very urgent. So, can anything be done about this? Every summer, the CO2 level of the planet goes down for a little while, and then it goes back up. So, there's some mechanism here that we could possibly utilize that has been proven to work on a global scale. What is it? Well, it turns out there is much more land in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, so that when the sun heats up the northern hemisphere, we start growing trees in the summertime, we can actually reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. However, as winter comes on, the CO2 level goes up, and then industrialization just marches along. Plants absorb CO2 out of the air through the photosynthesis. We all understand that. But people don't really understand that it only works when they're in sunlight and when they're growing. In the fall and the winter time, they're giving off CO2, and they're also shedding leaves. And of course, when they die, it all goes back into the atmosphere. There are 2 fundamental types of photosynthesis, C3 plants and C4 plants. Corn, switchgrass, sugarcane, sorghum, which is a food crop, and other range grasses are C4 plants. They can capture carbon dioxide at about 10 times the effectivity per unit area of C3 plants. A huge increase in carbon capture per unit area. And if you go one step further and compare this to a mature or climax forest, that forest is really not capturing any CO2 on net because the trees have already come to full height. So if we compare a fast-growing C4 crop to a mature forest, we can get 100x gain. And that's manifested by seeing soybeans, which are a C3 crop, 2 feet tall at harvest, giant miscanthus, 20 feet tall at harvest. 2 feet versus 20 feet, and that's all captured carbon. But when the plants die, it all goes back into the atmosphere. We have devised a new fuel cycle to make use of this fast-growing plant material, but also capture the carbon. This is our negative carbon fuel cycle, and it starts with photosynthesis, growing plants, and preferably a fast-growing C4 plant that has a food component like corn or sugarcane or sorghum. We get the food off of it. We take 50 to 70% of the plant mass into our biomass fractionator technology, which I'll talk about in a moment, and produce a high-octane gasoline, which is technology that we have proven out. Then we take the remaining char. We have learned how to, in about 2 weeks, turn that into a very powerful soil amendment. So it will go in the soil and grow more plants. And this soil amendment has very inert carbon in it that will stay in the soil for hundreds of years. So that feeds back to grow more crops. So now we have a wonderful positive feedback loop. We grow food, we make fuel, we sequester carbon, we take CO2 out of the air, and the thing is a positive feedback loop that increases productivity as we run. I believe a truly marvelous idea. How effective is the soil amendment? Well, if we take a unit of productive land, such as an acre of corn, and we run it through the biomass fractionator and make negative carbon fuel and a soil enhancer, in 4 to 8 years we can take unproductive land like desert soil and upgrade it to productive land off of that unit of land. So 1 acre of productive farmland can create another acre of productive farmland in 4 to 8 years. A very rapid replication cycle. We do this with 3 core technologies. Our biomass fractionator takes biomass in and strips off accessible hydrocarbon radicals and convert them into high-octane gasoline. Then we take the excess carbon that comes off as an inert material and we treat that with a fungal type treatment to add protein coating to it so that it can capture water and nutrients. And with that protein coating on it, plant roots are attracted to it. This particular version is specifically for upgrading desert soil into productive farmland. This is a control without biochar, and this is with 40% biochar added. Dramatic effects in just a few weeks. So instead of taking years to upgrade the soil, we can do it in a matter of weeks. So, what is our rollout model? Well, we are well along in rolling this out for the developed world in terms of being only a 2-year-old company. We're proud to have Google as an investor along with General Electric, BP, ConocoPhillips, Constellation Energy, and NRG, and we have several other oil companies in the pipeline. These are actual investors in the company, and we're planning to put out 2,000 50 million gallon per year plants worldwide, producing about 100 quads of energy.
You use more of our fuel, we take more CO2. That is contrarian technology. So we think this is world changing. We think we can make gasoline for $1 to $1.50 a gallon and jet for around $2 a gallon. These are mobile units. These are like cargo containers on wheels, and each of those pairs will make 2 million gallons a year using your biomass and a substantial amount of biochar. This is what it would look like in a cornfield in the Midwest. We anticipate not having any tanks. This is literally a mobile facility. It's easier to permit, easier to set up, and we're always moving biomass in, biochar, and fuel out. Our plans are to do commercial plants in the size of 10 million gallons a year, going up to 50 million gallons a year. We want to do 400 of those in the US and another 1,600 globally. So if you've got 2,000 plants making 50 million gallons a year, 100 billion gallons a year. So we think we're right around 10% of the US fuel use with the 400, and we're about 10 to 15% of global fuel use with the 2,000 when we get them put out.
So, Google.org, who has been following this because of Google's investment, came to us a few months ago with a very novel proposal at the time, which is, what about 100,000 miniature plants for the emerging world, million gallon per year plants? And we've done all the analysis on this, and it looks very good. It looks like we can put a plant like that in for about $1 million. The payback is 2 to 3 years. The village of 1,000 people would net $1 million in revenue, besides making all the fuel they need, making 60 kilowatts of electricity for the 1,000 people. And although it's kind of exotic technology to put in a village, it runs 24/7, it employs a lot of people, it powers your lights and your television sets and your computers so that it takes the village out of extreme poverty up to kind of mid-range developing world with at least an 8x increase in village income per capita. About a year ago, when Google first invested in the company, we proposed a very bold plan, and that is that for 1% of the world's land mass, we could power all the world's cars. For 2% of the world's land mass, we could drag the world back to carbon neutrality, basically. And for 3% of the world's land mass, we could actually reduce atmospheric CO2 by 100 ppm in about 40 years because of running this positive feedback loop. Now, a year ago, we used some fairly ambitious yield numbers, which Google.org run it about a little bit, but said, yeah, this is possible to do. And I'm very proud to say that about a week ago, in the laboratory on a large pilot scale, we exceeded the long-term yield numbers that would be needed to make this work. So we are actually getting yield today from giant Miscanthus produced by the University of Mississippi that gives us higher yield numbers than this model uses. So this looks to me like a very effective and straightforward way to both reverse global warming and bring 100 million plus people out of extreme poverty. Thank you.
As I said, next month we'll be 3 years old. We are a very young company and moving very fast, but we need to do that if we're going to get the traction that we need to help turn the CO2 around and help make a negative carbon fuel. R&D fractionator that came up in 2010, the pilot plant in 2012, and then a Midwest commercial scale plant in 2013, and then the US Rollout 2018 to get about 400 of these plants out and then go global. We're a disruptive force in a large global industry. Liquid fuels is a $3 trillion market a year, and but it is not the biggest. The food and the agriculture industry is the biggest in the world. This is the second largest, but we want to be a disruptive force here.
What I'm going to try to do today is tell you how we've worked for the last few years to take biochar to market, both in the tropics and in the United Kingdom. My great-grandfather plowed virgin prairie in the 1880s. In fact, my great-great-grandfather plowed virgin prairie in Wisconsin in the 1840s. That process of decarbonization of the Midwest led to a reduction of soil carbon content from about 100 tons per hectare to a level now that in some places is as low as 5 tons per hectare. If they'd had Google Maps in 1890, that part of Nebraska would be black. Now it's a sort of pale beige color. When you break down the life of soil, you're also taking away the agglomerative properties of the soil biota, which die off, particularly when you plow deeper with tractors and use nitrates. When that agglomeration stops, the soil falls apart. The result in the Midwest was the Dust Bowl. The same thing has happened since in the steppes of Central Asia, in the pampas of Argentina, and most recently in the breadbasket of China, Heilongjiang province. Now, how do farmers play out in the climate change scenario? An industrial farmer uses 12 to 15 calories of fossil fuel to produce a calorie of food. An organic farmer uses 6 calories of fossil fuel. The Rodell Institute in Amos, Pennsylvania is in their 30th year of comparative trials of organic and industrial farming. They've shown a year-on-year accumulation of soil carbon of about 1 ton per hectare. Well, what would happen if everybody in the US went organic, or indeed if everyone in the world went organic? You would see a swing of about 1.25 gigatons from negative to positive sequestration in the US, and from 3.6 gigatons emitted globally to about 6 sequestered. Now that's very idealized, but it gives you a sense of the potential of farming to do something even without biochar. Put biochar into the equation, and agriculture becomes the powerhouse of reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas. So how do we make this real? We just took a simple ring kiln. This is what charcoal makers have been using in Britain for 100 years. We call it the Superchar 100. It produces 250 pounds of biochar in an 8-hour day. The larger kiln we call the Superchar 1000. In 1 month, the lettuces raised in our compost were double the size of the other ones. We're also working in the tropics, and 4 years ago, John Moussouris of Van Earth took 3 cacao farmers from Belize to Cornell University, gave them a 2-day intensive training in the production and use of biochar. They went back, they started making biochar. They planted out 1-year-old cacao tree seedlings. Now normally a cacao tree takes 7 years to bear fruit. These were bearing fruit after 3 years. That got Kraft excited. Kraft bought my chocolate business. They bought 10 of our kilns. Those are now up and running in Belize. And subsequently, the farmers have applied to the United Nations Development Program because producing biochar increases rural incomes, reduces migration to cities, protects biodiversity, reverses soil degradation. So they've just given the farmers $50,000 to buy more kilns. We've initiated programs of biochar trials with the sugar growers in Belize, and the UNDP is saying if those results come out right, they'll contribute $500,000 towards expanding a biochar program. The Carbon Gold is our brand. Our intel inside is GrowChar, and that's our proprietary formula of biochar that's ground with mycorrhizal fungi. We're marketing ourselves as an investment in the long-term health and value of your land, not as a short-term compost.
These are the last 2 pairs of boots I've gone through this year. I have a very personal relationship with char. I've been producing it very hands-on. I do a lot of research to what the people who have laboratories are giving us. But I also have my own intuition from what I've learned wearing out boots. This is red oak. This is red oak biochar. It's the same. What you start with is what you get. The different tendencies of wood. If it's a very dense wood, it'll be a very dense biochar. If you have material like a shell, like a macadamia nut shell, that is not designed to transport food and water, it's designed to protect. As a biochar, it will not transport food and water, it will protect. Something really interesting was rotten wood. In all the biochar pits that I'm doing, I'm finding these chunks of wood every now and then that are extremely absorbent of water. We're hosing everything down, keep it moist and keep it safe. And while we're doing that, some pieces, it takes a couple seconds for the water to soak in. Others, it's just immediate. And I was trying to figure out, what kind of wood is this? I figured out it's not a kind of wood. It's a state at which the wood was in. It's rotten. So you already have the transporting, mechanisms from the original plant material. And on top of that, you have a network that the fungal hyphae have laid down. So you have an extremely porous material that very quickly transfers water. He has a tomato farm, and he bought several truckloads, and immediately noticed. He didn't even have to do side-by-side trials because he's been growing tomatoes for 35 years, and he was really happy with the results. The bummer is that biochar kind of lasts forever, so it was a one-time sale. So he just keeps on reusing it because he recycles his potting media, and then he recomposts it, and then it goes back and forth. But he's happy, and I'm happy for him. Of the various feedstocks I have, the density of the material has a dramatic impact on the char that's made. The denser the material, the higher potential surface area that you can achieve. But I've also seen that the less dense it is, the better it seems to do with water, because it's more porous, there's more empty space within it. So it can more easily deal with water. And what I've learned from my handling of feedstocks, I think grasses will be fantastic, especially when water is an issue, because they're basically these large capillary tubes. They're meant to transport food and water very quickly throughout the material, and I feel like the grasses, and there's some research to support that as well, the grasses will make very good biochars when water is an issue.
As an industry, as a movement, who are we? What are we doing here? Here is our biochar status update. This comes from work at 3 different organizations that I've been working with. Started with work at the Carbon War Room, that's Richard Branson's nonprofit. Unfortunately, the Carbon War Room decided to pull their biochar operation, and they did that without releasing any of the work that we had done, and they made a conscious decision to do that. And in part, when I first started working with the Carbon War Room, I tried to explain to them that, biochar is kind of young. Looking at the billion-dollar opportunities is a very great top-down kind of thing to do. But it's very top-down, and we're very bottom-up right now. And I think it was once that survey was completed that they were sort of like, oh wow, this is really early. There are more than 110 biochar companies worldwide. Most of us are small companies. We've got 42 organizations that are less than 3 people. There are 23 organizations that are less than 10, 4 that responded that are less than 25, and 7 that are greater than 50. It's lack of funding often that comes up, which is why people can't expand more. Retail prices for biochar range from 12 cents a pound, that was in Uganda, to $6 a pound. Average price is $1.67 per pound. Biochar is still priced way higher than most of the highest end products out there. A function of the early stage of the technology, people are still getting the tech online and not producing consistently. There's definitely more capital that's moving into biochar, but the number that I would like to see, this is a number that Carbon War Room has really like to see, that there is money moving into biochar. And that creates a signal like, okay, we're not the only early foolish investor. There's other people out there who are doing this. And here is the list of the 110, 112 biochar companies. This is who we are. We're still really early, but we're doing really well.